Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's panel that will focus on how to effectively advocate on behalf of the Legal Services Corporation. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished and featured speaker who will lead today's presentation and discussion, Mr. Ronald Flagg. Ronald Flagg was appointed the Vice President of the Legal Services Corporation in February 2020 and has served as Vice President for Legal Affairs and General Counsel since 2013. Previously, Mr. Flagg also served as the President of the District of Columbia Bar from 2010 through 2011 and currently serves as Chair of the Bar's Pro Bono Task Force. In addition, he presently also chairs the board of the National Veterans Legal Services Program. We are delighted to have him here with us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ron.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to work on behalf of LSC. You will be speaking to Congress during the most challenging period in the history of legal aid in America. I realize that's quite a dramatic statement, but for the reasons I will now describe, I truly believe it to be the case. Let me say at the outset that LSC and the 132 legal aid providers we fund throughout the country are responding to the pandemic with great courage, dedication, and ingenuity. We, however, desperately need additional funding to meet the current and upcoming challenges, and that is where your help is indispensable. LSC, with the support of the American Bar Association and its president, Trish Shrifo, and many others, is currently seeking an additional $350 to $500 million in emergency funding. Your support in explaining the enormous spike in legal needs caused by the pandemic, particularly in your states and communities, and the critical role LSC and legal aid programs play in meeting those needs is indispensable. At the same time, we are seeking the supplemental funding. The appropriations process for fiscal year 2022 is underway. Again, it is critical that members of Congress hear from you, their constituents, about LSC's annual appropriations. LSC is requesting just over $1 billion for fiscal year 2022, by far the largest appropriation LSC has ever requested. But the size of our appropriation request reflects the enormous justice gap in America, the surge in numbers of people falling into poverty as a result of the pandemic, and the spikes in the grave civil legal needs arising out of the pandemic and its economic consequences, such as unemployment claims, evictions, and domestic violence cases. Civil legal aid is racial justice work. About 60% of our grantees' clients are people of color. And this preponderance of people of color facing housing, employment, healthcare, and family issues is not a coincidence. Civil legal aid attorneys are on the front lines battling the barriers to justice created by the intersection of race and poverty. Civil legal aid is critical to carry out the other federal policy responses to poverty and the pandemic. Federal poverty policy responses to the pandemic, including the moratorium on evictions and the provision of rental assistance funding, are vital interventions. Yet there are millions of low-income Americans that have yet to be reached by these critical initiatives. For example, legal assistance is urgently needed to prevent thousands of evictions from occurring in direct violation of the federal moratorium, or through the exploitation of its limitations. Similarly, federal unemployment benefit supplements and the economic impact payments have greatly mitigated the effects of the economic crisis. However, many people have needed the assistance of legal aid advocates to actually receive these income supports, and still more have been excluded because they were not able to access legal help. With that, let me get right to our major reason for needing your assistance: the chronic underfunding of civil legal aid in America and the devastating effect that's having on access to justice and the people we are trying to serve. Let me take you back to 1994. LSC's annual appropriations at that time was $400 million. And 27 years later, we're still in the $400 million neighborhood. even after $80 million in appropriation increases in the past 5 years, for which we are very grateful. Our FY 2021 appropriation is just $465 million, far below the funding needed to keep up with increases in the poverty population, growing civil legal needs, and even inflation. Let me give you another benchmark for appraising that $465 million figure. Last August, then Senator Harris asked us to do an analysis regarding the cost of serving low-income people facing the risk of eviction. Our analysis showed that about 5 million Americans eligible for LSC-funded services are at risk for eviction because of job losses. We estimate that it would cost an additional $2.5 billion for our grantees to assist these folks. LSC's inadequate funding level, of course, has had direct consequences for the people who we are seeking to serve. LSC and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago did a study in 2017 of the justice gap, the difference between the civil legal needs of people living in poverty and the resources available to meet those needs. We found that 86% of the civil legal problems of low-income Americans were met with inadequate or no assistance. And that was in the good old days before the pandemic. The pandemic is dramatically increasing the justice gap. The pandemic has had profound effects on legal needs, both by increasing the numbers of people falling into poverty and causing surges in many kinds of civil legal needs. About 57 million people, or 18% of the US population, were eligible for LSC-funded services back in 2018, the most recent year for which US Census Bureau figures are available. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, however, we expect the size of the eligible population to increase significantly. We can look at the period between 2008 and 2012 following the Great Recession to provide a rough sense as to what will happen as a result of our current pandemic. During and following the Great Recession, the LSC eligible client population increased by over 11 million people. That's over 17%. The pandemic has caused far more people to lose their jobs and fall into poverty than did the Great Recession. The civil legal needs of low-income Americans have surged during the pandemic, especially in those very case types served by LSC grantees, such as evictions, unemployment, domestic violence, and healthcare. I'll give you a few examples. Atlanta Legal Aid reports that calls related to unemployment have skyrocketed with a 1,200% increase from the prior year. Despite the eviction moratorium around the country, eviction cases account for nearly 45% of all housing cases LSC grantees handled in 2020, nearly double the year before. In South Carolina, for example, our grantees' caseloads of private landlord-tenant evictions in the latter half of 2020 more than doubled compared to the first half of the year. Iowa Legal Aid saw a 200% increase in eviction cases in 2020 over 2019 filings. Atlanta Legal Aid reported that applicants seeking protection from intimate partner abuse have increased 47%, and we've seen similar increases elsewhere in the country. Our grantees and the FTC are also seeing market increases in consumer scams, particularly those aimed at the elderly. These scams are particularly pernicious in the face of a health crisis in which the elderly face the gravest risks. While seeing a dramatic spike in needs for their services, legal aid programs are faced with a precipitous decline in resources available from state and local funds. The National Association of IOLTA programs, and those are the folks who administer state and local funds, found that IOLTA state and local funding declined by $87 million in 2020, even as needs were spiking. Legal aid providers are also dealing with the spike in needs for their services at a time when they face acute operating barriers. Nearly all LSC's grantees have had to close some or all of their offices and work and provide their services remotely. The enormous justice gap, exacerbated by the pandemic, will only be reduced if we are willing to invest substantially more funds to close it. LSC is seeking those funds both as part of the supplemental appropriation process and in our FY 2022 annual appropriation. The supplemental funding we are requesting is emergency support. It is in addition to our request for LSC's annual appropriation. Our neighbors living in poverty around the country and our grantees seeking to help them need both. I want to end where I began. Thank you for taking the time to speak on behalf of the millions of Americans living in poverty who need help with the life-impacting civil legal issues with which they are confronted every day. Thank you for helping to advance access to justice in America at the most challenging moment in the history of civil legal aid. Remember that for every phone call, email, or tweet, you bring with you the most important thing that matters to every member of Congress. You are his or her constituent. Constituent voices matter. You can bring home how this worldwide pandemic is affecting the communities and constituents your member serves. Good luck, and thank you very much.
Ron, thank you. And thank you everybody who joined today's call and for all of your efforts in helping to secure additional and supplemental funding for the Legal Services Corporation. Take care.
Hello, my name is J. Michelle Childs, and I am a United States District Court judge and currently the chair of the American Bar Association's Judicial Division. I am pleased to introduce James Duff, who is going to talk to you about the state of judicial security and efforts that are underway in Congress to strengthen it. There is no one more knowledgeable about the issue or more committed to making sure that judges and their families have the protection and the tools they need to perform their job and issue decisions without fear of harm. Jim was executive director of the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts when the horrific murder of Judge Esther Salas's son and wounding of her husband occurred last summer. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Jim and his staff assisted the Judicial Conference of the United States in drafting recommendations for congressional action to improve judicial security. He spent the remainder of 2020 working diligently with Congress to advance their proposals. Jim is a committed public servant. He served as director of the Administrative Office of the Courts from 2006 to 2011, and then returned upon the request of Chief Justice John Roberts to again serve from 2015 to 2020. Jim is currently the executive director of the Supreme Court Historical Society. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much, Judge Childs. I'm sure you're all familiar with the tragedy that befell Judge Esther Salas and her family on July 19th, 2020. An assailant impersonating a package delivery driver went to her home in New Jersey, opened fire, and killed Judge Salas's 20-year-old only child, Daniel, and seriously wounded her husband, Mark. The attacker was a disgruntled litigant who found her personal information, including her home address, on the internet. The Judge Salas attack is not an isolated event. It was not the first act of violence on a federal judge, but we all need to work very hard to do all we can to try to make sure it's the last. The murders of Judge John Wood, Judge Richard Duranko, Judge Robert Vance, the husband and mother of Judge Joan Lefkow, Judge John Roll, over the past several years, and now the murder of the son of Judge Salas, demand that action be taken to improve judicial security. In June of 2013, Chief Judge Timothy Corrigan of the Middle District of Florida was targeted by a gunman who purchased his address on the internet for $1.95. The gunshot, fired into the judge's Florida home, missed his ear by less than 2 inches. This past November, a judge's address was circulated on social media, urging people to gather outside his home while the judge was hearing a high-profile case. Most recently, an armed intruder entered a judge's chambers in California, threatened to kill the judge, and then fled after the judge, who was physically unharmed, was able to call 911. Courthouses also have been attacked. A drive-by shooting on May 29th, 2020 at the Ronald V. Dellums Federal Building and Courthouse in Oakland, California, killed Protective Security Officer David Underwood. On September 15th, 2020, at the Sandra Day O'Connor Federal Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona, the federal judiciary again was attacked by a drive-by shooter who opened fire on a United States Marshal Services court security officer outside the courthouse. Threats and violence against the judges have become all too common. The danger to judges in the federal courts is getting worse. The number of threats and inappropriate communications has risen over 500% in the last 5 years. These vicious acts of violence against the judiciary at home and at work underscore the urgent need for immediate congressional action to address the critical security needs of federal judges, court employees, those who protect our courthouses across the country, and the safety of the public at our nation's courthouses. Following the tragic murder of Judge Salas's son, when I was the director of the Administrative Office of the United States Courts and Secretary of the Judicial Conference of the United States, we adopted and delivered to Congress a comprehensive set of proposals to improve judicial security. These included protecting and maintaining the privacy of judges' personally identifiable information. By that, we mean, among other things, home addresses, telephone numbers, personal email addresses, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, photographs of any vehicles that displays the license plates numbers, and things of this nature, very specifically defined in the bill. We also drafted and proposed legislation included in the bill that would ensure improved U.S. Marshal Services capability to provide security to the federal judiciary. We also proposed funding mechanisms for these improvements, many of which Congress has now already implemented, and we're very grateful for those. The provisions were addressed in S 4711, the Daniel Anderl Judicial Security and Privacy Act of 2020, and its parallel bill, H.R. 8591, which was introduced by Representative Sherrill of New Jersey in the House, and related appropriations requests. The Senate Bill 4711 was introduced on September 24th, 2020 by Senator Robert Menendez and Senator Cory Baker, and was co-sponsored by Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham and Ranking Member Dianne Feinstein. This bipartisan bill would have protected judges' personally identifiable information from resale by data brokers. The legislation would also allow federal judges to secure the redaction of personal information displayed on federal government internet sites and will prevent publication of personal information by other businesses and individuals where there is no legitimate news media interest or matter of public concern. The bill encourages states through a grant program to protect personal information. It improves the ability of the United States Marshal Service to identify threats, and it authorizes improvements to home and court security technology. S 4711 was carefully crafted to protect and respect the First Amendment right of the press to report on matters of public concern, and it balances that right with an interest of highest order, and that is to protect the security of judges. The legislation recognizes and protects the press's right to report on judicial malfeasance or other newsworthy information regarding federal judges and their immediate family members, or to investigate and inform on newsworthy matters. The bill was also narrowly tailored to further a compelling government interest, that is, the safety of federal judges and the derivative ability of the judiciary to function. In response to the killing of Judge Salas's only child, Daniel, the governor of New Jersey signed into law similar legislation that protects judges' personal information. It's known as Daniel's Law. We came very close to passing the federal version of Daniel's Law in the last lame duck session of Congress. One senator held up its passage at the very end of the session, not out of opposition to the bill and its substance, but rather because he wanted to include members of Congress in the bill too. We expect the bill to be reintroduced soon. And the support of the American Bar Association of this legislation is greatly appreciated and very much needed. It is essential in our system of justice that judges decide cases without fear for their safety and that of their family. We must implore Congress to act on these critical safety measures now. There's no time to wait further. Every day that goes by leaves our courts, our judges, our court personnel, and the public exposed to continued violence. We thank you very much for your assistance and your advocacy for this important legislation. Thank you.